So recording now. So if everyone can make sure that they've muted their microphones, I can also mute you for you if needed. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today, who is Gil Rothschild Elyassi. He is currently a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley in the Jurisprudence and Social Policy program, on the verge or the cusp of becoming a PhD, so just about there, and also currently a postdoc at the University of Haifa. So he will be giving us a talk on reading punishment with Du Bois, from a one world to a double consciousness hermeneutics. So Gil, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ashley. And if you can allow me to share my screen.
Right, yeah. Yes, sorry about that. I should have thought of that earlier.
So yeah, hi, everyone. As Ashley said, I'm Gil Rothschild Elyassi. I have just, my dissertation was just approved a couple of months ago. And I'm excited and grateful to see you all today and to share with you this, this work from this ongoing project that comes out of my dissertation research. And thank you very much, Ashley, for bringing us together today again, and for doing so much for this community. And thanks everyone here who could make it today under the various circumstances I imagine people are in. So I'm gonna go ahead and share the screen. Right. So I want to talk with you all today about this paper I'm working on, tentatively called Reading Law and Punishment with Du Bois, from a one world to double consciousness hermeneutics. Now, this paper is primarily written as a grounded theoretical inquiry, and while it is firmly rooted in 3.5 years of ethnographic work, it does not utilize data in the commonplace social scientific sense of the term. In fact, a central purpose of this paper is to find, adapt, or elaborate a generative way to think through the 3.5 years during which I was with or in close proximity to supervised people, all kinds of technologies of supervision, and legal and penal proceedings. In this sense, I see this theoretical inquiry as intimately related to our long-standing and translocal struggles to reconsider how we do what we do, and specifically as part of reinvigorated conversations about reimagining or decolonizing knowledge and academic practices. To be a little bit more specific, as I began to approach my ethnographic materials analytically, I searched for and struggled to find a frame that would help me to think through what I encountered and what I wanted to focus on, which is, to state it very generally, concerns the radically asymmetrical encounter between worlds or realities. And this is something that was welling up in me as an outsider in the US, as well as someone who grew up, like so many of us, amidst worlds of destruction, colonization, dispossession, and pain, and who had very little language to speak of all of this. And as I talked to more graduate students, colleagues, mentors, I found that I was not alone, and that our field, like any field in the proper sense of the term, can be defined as a field precisely because it is bounded by certain forces, presumptions, and frames, which of course provide a lot of explanatory and analytic vigor, yet which also set certain boundaries or parameters. And this paper is an attempt to join numerous others in thinking through these boundaries from a perspective that has thus far been excluded from our field. Specifically, I refer to a Du Boisian perspective that foregrounds the color line and the veil as a barrier of recognition, and importantly, that recognizes the existence of more than one world, and thus of the possibility of more than one ontology, and of ontological dominance, as well as refusal. In this sense, the inquiry is continuous with and draws upon recent work in sociology on the denied Du Boisian legacy, including by Aldon Morris and Carita Brown and Jose Itzigson. But it is also heavily informed by traditions of knowledge in which Du Bois has not been excluded or marginalized, and in which he is in fact central, including Black studies and Africana philosophy, as well as work on decolonization. And I also should add a quick note here already that I realize that the use of the term ontology is loaded and may cause a certain unease, if not an unpleasant itch. And I do not use it offhandedly. In this sense, the framework I develop or try to begin to develop has some resonance with science and technology studies and with what is called in the ontological turn in anthropology, which is closely tied to the decolonial turn. And yet, as already noted, as many others note, a Du Boisian notion of ontology seems more closely linked to the predicament of race and specifically of Blackness. But all of this about ontology for now is a footnote, since I will be more using the term in this talk, the notion of separate yet adjacent worlds. And I'm happy to return to ontology at any point. Again, this is a work in progress. It is a revision of the first chapter of my dissertation, which was approved recently. And so I'm very grateful for this opportunity to present it today, to think together with you all about it. And given the exploratory nature of this inquiry, I realize that it may seem schematic at certain points, yet I believe this is an important exercise in this moment. And this is also why I wanted to tap into this resource of our community. Okay. So to ground the problem I'm thinking through, I want to begin with two short practices that I think poignantly bring out the gulf between two spheres of existence, or what we may consider with Du Bois as separate yet adjacent worlds. The first practice is one that I came across while wearing an ankle monitor and accompanying GPS officers as they operate the GPS monitoring system, as well as while talking with monitor people. In essence, this practice involved GPS officers bringing supervised youth into the closed off high security monitoring unit with the purpose of showing the youth how they appear from this systemic perspective. That is, how they look as a moving target on a screen, devoid of any sort of kinship, any family and friends, any context and circumstances. As the officers explained, the youth needed to see this reduction or degradation of their lives and reality for them to understand, to really register the abyss that lies between their world and the world of the law. The abyss that separates the way they experience themselves and their realities and the reductive ways in which they figure for the system. The second practice is one that I first learned about from Simone, an African-American probation officer whom I closely accompanied for several months. Simone would occasionally take youth under her supervision out as a group, specifically to places such as theater shows or quote unquote nice restaurants. As she emphasized, these are places that many youth of color from impoverished neighborhoods would otherwise never frequent, given the depth of their material and spatial segregation. Simone stressed that these outings were not really intended to have fun with the youth. In fact, fun had very little to do with them. Instead, often the youth would get scared and even paralyzed as they would sense how conspicuous they are in the white space, that they are indeed out of place, surrounded by predominantly white and exclusively wealthy people who clearly know very little, if anything, about non-white spaces. Yet this terror and paralysis was precisely why these outings were so important from Simone's perspective. Her intention was to make the youth experience this disjuncture between their world and the white world, and importantly, to help or teach them how to manage the situation as safely as possible, hopefully without getting people to call the police on them. For if these youth are going to find a job, to open a bank account, to get by in life in one way or another, they must know how to navigate white spaces as safely as possible. The image here in this slide, by the way, is taken from the movie Get Out, that in many ways explores the terror of being Black in white space, which is also, not incidentally, the title of a new book by Elijah Anderson that I haven't yet read, but I read previous work leading up to this book, which was just published, and I'm very much looking forward to reading. So there is a lot to say about these practices, but for now, I wish to focus on one fundamental aspect. In the two instances, the problem the officers seek to address only begins to make sense if we realize that the youth here live outside the world in some sense, of the world of the law in the first instance, and of the world of wealthy white folks in the second instance. The youth may be well familiar with the felt violence of these worlds over their bodies and lives, but they are in some important sense illiterate in their logics and internal machinations. They live in a different world, and importantly, their world is not easily or at all connectable, assimilable, or translatable to the world of the law, wealth, and whiteness. there is a gap here that they must somehow cross, and which they regularly must cross alone. Importantly, this gap is more than cultural. To describe it as cultural is to underappreciate what Du Bois and many others in his step repeatedly expressed. This gap is an abyss between worlds. And in this sense, it is an ontological gap, a gap that separates realities. And punishment and law regularly operate across this gap, and penalized folk must continuously contend with it. In fact, I think that this gap poses one fundamental problem for law and punishment, which regularly, as I said, operate across worlds and must therefore engage in some sort of ontological translation or mediation. And yet it seems that this gap remains relatively under-theorized and under-noted in our respective fields of inquiry, though things are continuously changing. So one leg of this inquiry, the inquiry sets out to explore, is precisely the nature of this lacuna in our field. That is to ask, what is it that has made the sociology of law and the sociology of punishment develop relatively little language and vocabulary to consider this fundamental problem? In general terms, I think that a big part of the answer lies in the fact that the sociology of law and punishment has emerged and evolved through a heavy focus on drawing connections between penal practices and cultural or economic trends, connections between penal practices in different locales or across time, connections between penal practices and subjectivities, consciousness or modes of resistance or friction. And while this focus on connection is extremely productive and has taken us very far, on its own, it leaves us relatively little equipped to speak of this juncture and in the ontological sense of the term. And thus also to speak of that impossible yet frequent moment of encounter between unreconciled worlds, that liminal space in which the world of the law and the worlds of those whom the law makes into its target awkwardly yet disastrously meet. Accordingly, the second leg of this inquiry joins long-standing traditions to begin to elaborate a Du Boisian approach for the study of law and punishment that offers one alternative path for engaging this problem or this lacuna. For Du Bois, a foundational feature of modernity, and accordingly of modern law, is precisely the color line in this ontological sense of the term. From this follows his well-known articulation of double consciousness, that embodied split between two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings. A split that results from the necessity to inhabit unreconciled worlds with one dark body, to use Du Bois's words. This recognition of more than one world sets a very different point of departure, one in which connection, while continuing to be central in major respects, must always figure alongside disjuncture or irreducibility. And while Du Bois was very early to articulate this point, there are today various traditions that pursue similar paths, including Black feminism and post-decolonial theory, to really name only a couple. And this gets us to the question that animates the paper. What does it mean to think of the sociology of law and punishment from a starting point that foregrounds the Du Boisian color line? And the phrase starting point is key here, since my intention in this paper is not so much to explore what it means to add or include the works of Du Bois in the well-formed canon or to existing syllabi. This form of inclusion has, of course, many benefits, but it also maintains the original starting point, so to speak. And from this starting point, it extends outward to include more. Alternatively, I wish to join others in the current moment and ask, what does it mean to read law and punishment from a Du Boisian point of origin? And this is the general outline of the inquiry. I first consider three more prominent and distinct orientations in the sociology of law and the sociology of punishment. I then explore their common grounds from a Du Boisian perspective, and specifically their heavy focus on connections and continuity. And lastly, I begin to elaborate a double consciousness hermeneutics as a reorientation movement that does not simply do away with established approaches, but rather aims to make ample room for inquiries that are grounded in and oriented by multiple and alternative starting points. Okay, so the three orientations in very broad strokes, and building on previous analysis of analytic trajectories in our field. And here I do not attempt to situate these orientations chronologically or periodically, as I think it is helpful for this purpose to think of them also as simultaneous. And I also by no means suggest that there are rigid boundaries between them. In fact, I think that they are porous and mutually constitutive. And I will go relatively quick now because this is something we've been discussing and considering as a field for quite some time now. So again, I hope you could forgive me for the schematic nature. My intention is not to review the history of the field or to give an exhaustive account, but rather to identify and consider a difference within our field, as well as, and perhaps more importantly, prominent common dynamics. So the first orientation, which we may describe as operating in the spectrum of grand theoretical traditions, is first oriented toward the macro level in that it seeks to situate or consider law and punishment in society as a whole. And second, it seeks to do so with a theoretical syntax that foregrounds certain types of connections over others. To put it slightly differently, different accounts in this grand theoretical vein link legal and penal practice to different aspects of the social, economic or material domination, changing rationales of rule, or shifting modes of moral, cultural, and social ordering. This is, of course, not to say that accounts in this vein see law, punishment, or society, for that matter, as a unitary thing. They certainly and frequently emphasize fragmentation, divisions, conflict, and the importance of place. Yet what these accounts seem to have largely in common is the presumption that all these distinct and moving pieces of reality can be ultimately situated within, even if incrementally so, one picture. And proceeding from this presumption, they strive to connect. And this is an important point, to connect disparate pieces of the puzzle. Different traditions that operate under this orientation has often considered one another as rivals by insisting that it is their syntax that should be given analytic priority. That is, by insisting on a certain hierarchy of connections, for instance, material over symbolic, or vice versa. Yet this is insistent on a certain type of connections is by no means hegemonic today. And in the 1990s, David Garland has propounded and elaborated what he dubbed analytic plurality. Operating from this orientation, scholars of law and punishment do not need to choose a single tradition or analytic syntax. They can play for multiple teams at once, since each theory allows us to see some aspects of law and punishment while obscuring others. And this is a helpful quote from, sorry, I didn't mention in the slide, it is from Garland's 1990 book. And the quote says, each theory has a capacity to make visible particular aspects of possibly complicated and many-sided reality and connect these aspects to wider social processes. Each mode of inquiry sets up a particular image of punishment, defining it in a particular way, highlighting some of the aspects while inevitably obscuring or neglecting others. So under this orientation, we may and often do keep the focus on the macro level, yet we relax the insistence on the theoretical syntax or a hierarchy of connections. That is to say, connections remain central, but the type of connections we may draw are multiplied and diversified. Thus, we may see how in the Garland quote, the importance of connection is foregrounded. What all of the different theories do is to connect punishment to wider social processes. Each foregrounds different processes, but they are all in the business of connecting. And note as well that while the different theories emphasize different processes, the very possibility of treating them as complementary stands on an underlying presumption that reality is ultimately one. As Garland says, a many-sided reality. The implication is that that while we may never see the entire picture or the entire social world at once, we may gradually reveal more sides or aspects of it, more sections of this multidimensional puzzle. The last orientation, which again does not have to be mutually exclusive, is refers to, is primarily marked by how it redefines the scope of the analysis. From the macro to the meso, from the national to the global or local, from national or global to the local, from systems or structures to organizations or fields, from society as a whole to communities or places, and so forth. Here, the emphasis on connection remains very operative, yet within an altered and more limited scope, the penal or legal field, to take one prominent example. So, now, when we look at these different orientations together, and even as we take into account their radical differences from one another, I think we can still identify common grounds that are almost obvious for all of them, the focus on drawing connections between different phenomena. And importantly, by identifying this common thrust to connect, I by no means suggest that all accounts in the sociology of law and punishment subscribe or actively mobilize the presumption that all things must be connected. What I rather suggest is that a strong thrust to connect operates in the backdrop of our field as a field level scheme, so to speak, with which all accounts within the field must contend and which exerts pressure on all of us who engage in the sociology of law and punishment. And here comes an unsettling question. What happens when pieces of the puzzle refuse to be included in it? That is, refuse to be connected to other aspects of reality, or insist on standing on their own independent grounds? Here, a crucial hermeneutic challenge arises. What should we do with occurrences, behaviors, people, dynamics that seem to refuse connection? For instance, what should we do with the realization that there are often glaring discontinuities between the languages of punishment, the language of rehabilitation, retribution, deterrence, management, and the ways in which people experience punishment? Or more generally, what should we do with the glaring discontinuity between the white space and the black space, as the practices I began with foreground? And here, different orientations respond differently to this challenge. Again, in schematic terms, as it comes to macro level orientations, this challenge is quite radical, since it threatens to topple the possibility of producing one picture to begin with. One response to this challenge from this perspective is therefore to insist on the possibility of connection, refusals notwithstanding, through various hermeneutic maneuvers. For instance, through suggesting that some people do not recognize the true nature of their situation, which allows researchers to treat what they say and do as surface appearances that should be ultimately explained by deeper processes and forces. Thus, through recourse to something deeper than what people say and do, this hermeneutics regains the ability to connect over and against refusals. Another possibility, which I already briefly mentioned, is to multiply the kind of possible connections we may draw. So if we encounter a material resistance, we can go to the symbolic route or other routes. And as for field level accounts, the response here is generally less ambitious and thus, I think, more palatable for many of us. In fact, often this orientation can sidestep this challenge by circumscribing the scope of the inquiry around an area of social life in which it seems more plausible to draw connections in the first place, such as between agonists or people who share a community or a certain social organizational sphere of existence. In the context of research on legal and penal control, this last type of response seems to have led to what Forrester, Armenta, and Osborne recently identified as differentiation by unit of analysis. Thus, while one body of work focuses on penal practices as they appear from the perspective of powerful institutions, a second tradition is concerned with the effects of punishments from the perspective of their target populations. In Du Boisian terms, each of these perspectives or traditions centers a different world or ontology within which connections seem more plausible. And so in all of these responses, the focus on connections remains central, and we are left with little analytic vocabularies to consider and explore ontological disjuncture or discontinuity. And it is here that I think that a Du Boisian sociology offers us a productive and respectful grammar. And to clarify, I do not suggest that current approaches do not, let alone cannot, speak of disjuncture and discontinuity. I rather suggest that we may greatly benefit from elaborating a Du Boisian sociology of law and punishment, which I believe can join other traditions of thought that have not received that much attention in our field. Now, I do not have the time today, nor the space in one paper to meticulously unpack what a Du Boisian sociology of law and punishment may look like. And either way, I think this is something that would be best done through grounded inquiries, as I attempt in my dissertation. And yet I think that we may gesture to a few elements from the Du Boisian corpus that can be particularly generative to think with and elaborate in the sociology of law and the sociology of punishment. So the first element, of course, is the color line itself, which, as Kerida Brown and Jose Itzigson rightfully note, is a foundational element in Du Bois's notion of modernity, which is one central thing that sets his sociology apart from other established accounts of modernity, and thus of modern law. And here I think that while we tend to use the notion of the color line quite prevalently to signify systemic discrimination or an oppression, that is to signify an empirical phenomenon, which is certainly a central part of how Du Bois used this term as well, I believe that this concept deserves much more analytical and theoretical attention in general and in the sociology of law and punishment in particular. One important meaning of the Du Boisian color line is precisely as a marker of separation or disjuncture between worlds, or as that which keeps certain people out of the world. Of course, this understanding of the color line can have much resonance in the study of law and punishment as technologies of enacting and maintaining ontological dominance. Importantly, the concept of the color line in this sense is not simply a description of a phenomenon. It is also, more foundationally, a glaring question mark over the ability of any one perspective to describe and connect all phenomena, all that exists. The color line, in this sense, cannot be part of the analysis. It cannot be subsumed in the bigger picture, since it is that which splits and multiplies the picture. This split may mean that no one language can capture all that exists, and that we must therefore also recognize the limits of sociology. This notion of the color line, importantly, is closely tied to Du Bois's focus and respect to the lived experience of Black folk. Du Bois, in fact, discussed this recognition in the limits of sociology in a relatively undernoted, especially in our field, essay from 1905 called Sociology Hesitant. And as one commentator noted, in this essay, Du Bois explicitly questions the capacity of any sociological syntax to represent reality by emphasizing the fundamental irreducibility and undecidability of concepts or phenomena. This reading of the color line then requires us or invites us to radically slow down when we look at the moment or space of encounters between worlds, to make room for disjuncture and discontinuity, and to be hesitant about the languages we use and which have been given or passed on to us. A second and related element in the Du Boisian corpus that I think it can prove extremely useful for the sociology of law and punishment is the notion of the veil. Again, in general terms, we may think of the veil as a barrier of recognition that inflicts any field of vision that is marked by hegemony, and specifically by whiteness. The veil is therefore not only found in how people see the world, it may also be thought of as something that is stitched together through legal and penal technologies that continuously operate across the color line, and which enacts what Fergus McNeill here has recently described as systemic degradation. Lastly, for now, I think that the notion of double consciousness can and should be elaborated in sociological inquiry in general and in our fields in particular. And it is particularly helpful here to return to one of Du Bois's most famous articulations, in which he speaks of two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Let's pause here for a minute on the term unreconciled in this seminal passage. Du Bois here speaks of strivings, occurrences, or aspects that cannot be connected, parts of or wholes that refuse inclusion, assimilation, or integration into one another. Accordingly, to the extent that this situation can indeed be made comprehensible or legible in any ordinary sense of the term, such comprehension surely cannot be achieved through placing the two occurrences or striving, which barely coexist in a single body within the same analytic frame. If we take seriously this notion of unreconciled strivings, we must also accept that a singular frame would forcibly connect them over and against a foundational feature of their relationship. Comprehending this state of affairs thus requires us to allow occurrences to remain disjointed and unreconciled, to let the paradox remain unsettled. Indeed, it may mean to respect the possibility that parts or whole may simply not be connected, even as they somehow continue to cohabit one body or one space. In this sense, I think that we may think of double consciousness again, not as a phenomenon, but rather as a paradoxical epistemic orientation. And if we embrace double consciousness as an epistemic orientation, I think one avenue this leads us is to a focus on translation and liminality, which I will not have the time to talk about now, but I will be more than happy to continue to discuss at any point in the near or less near future. And I think I will end here for today. And I again, thank you sincerely for your time and your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gil. So now we have time for Q&A. So if people want to, you basically have two options for questions. So if you want to get in the queue, go ahead and just add your name to the chat or say stack or whatever. If you don't want to ask your question live, you can just type it in the chat and then I can read it for you because we are being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, then you have that option. So, so we have a couple of moments as people get their kind of creative juices flowing and start thinking. So just fantastic job, Gil. This is like super stimulating and really interesting. I kept thinking about like Sykes and, you know, like just how race is completely absent from his book. And a lot of the concepts you're talking about from Du Bois, like help us to make sense of, you know, the veil. He's not even like recognizing race as a thing and is just kind of blind to it, which just kind of like leaves it out as this like, well, it's not even like fully explicit if I remember correctly. So just really has a lot of applications. So this is really interesting. Let's see, we're still waiting for other people to ask questions. I guess the other option you can do is put your hand up. Oh, I think I saw a hand. Elliot, yeah, go for it, Elliot.
Hi, thanks so much. And I apologize that my video is off. Wonderful presentation. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how your argument relates to Du Bois' substantive views on law and punishment. I know he had an essay critiquing the convict lease system and wrote about incarceration and Black Reconstruction. And I you know, I thought your talk was really thought-provoking, particularly on methodology of law and punishment. And I'm just wondering a little bit if you could connect that to Du Bois' substantive views on law, incarceration, convict leasing, et cetera. So maybe more of an instigation, but wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
So should I take one by one? Yeah. Thanks so much for this question. I actually have not yet. I think so as I said, I view this attempt mostly to kind of unsettle some of the presumptions in how we have been thinking about law and punishment over the past, you know, century. And you're right, it's mostly in this sense an epistemic and methodological inquiry. And I do think substantively, to link it to Du Bois's study on law, on punishment, and more generally, I think it's the locus where it's connected is on his focus on lived experiences. And how he treats them as independent points of origin, never as data to be incorporated into the analysis, and always as something to think with. In his, I think it's in the Black Reconstruction preface, he notes that he's going to treat Black people as ordinary human beings. And when he says that, he means that he's not gonna incorporate their experiences as data into the analysis. So about the more substantive analysis of law and punishment, that's something that I'm working on still. So I feel like tentative, still tentative to talk about. I think it's a little bit more, I need a little bit more thought on that.
Great, other question? Oh, Johan, go for it.
Thanks so much, Ashley, and thank you, especially Gil. I just characteristically thought-provoking, really just inspiring stuff. So thank you. I hope that you'll be patient if I kind of stumble over the wording of this, because I'm trying to kind of get this straight as I go. I think I'm with you insofar as you're building a an intervention about how within a given world, multiple sets of rules can govern people quite differently, and that we could reconstrue that, therefore, not as one world, but rather as two different worlds with their own respective sets of rules. I think I can get that, and that makes sense to me in the anecdotes that you shared, that someone is, for example, taken from one world governed by a set of rules, taken to a different world, and then they are fearful and paralyzed, I think were the words that you used, upon being subject to this different set of rules. This much, if I'm with you that far, then I think I get it. But I hear you making an intervention that extends much farther than just the different rules that govern people in different sets of spaces. You're actually saying that we're not talking about different rules governing different people in different ways, depending on the spaces that they occupy, but you're saying you're making a meta-theoretical intervention, that the very theories with which we make sense of rules that govern people are might be inapplicable when understanding one as opposed to understanding another. You're moving, I mean, to use to repurpose Eliot's language from their question a moment ago, you're moving from the substantive to the meta-theoretical, and that's the bit that's hard for me to wrap my mind around. And I was hoping that you can, I suppose this is just, Gil, can you clarify? Because I can make sense of people are subject to very different rules depending on who they are and where they are. But it's not yet resonating for me that necessitates that actually you need totally different theoretical frameworks in order to make sense of those different idiosyncratically located rules. Is the question I'm posing making sense?
Yes, I think.
Thank you. Okay, that's
I
already.
appreciate it, and it's really helpful for me. Yeah, thanks very much for this question. I think that, yeah, the first clarification I need to work through is, what do I mean by different worlds? And yeah, I feel like many readers of Du Bois treats he often uses, very often uses the term worlds, different worlds, the outside of the world, in various, all throughout his corpus. And I think we often readers of these phrases kind of interpret them metaphorically, but along, long-standing tradition in Black studies, in other work, asked what if we take it seriously, and it goes back to, so the contention here, like building from Du Bois onward, right, through the maybe one radical current instantiation of this line of thought in Afro-pessimism, suggests that there is no ontology, right? It builds on Fanon and Du Bois to suggest that there is no ontology for the Black man, in the sense that they have no capacity to create the foundational building blocks in which they must live, with which they must live, right? It's a radical contention, right? That their world is just, that they, in some sense, people are outside of the world. There are various articulations of it, but Du Bois does not, I mean, sometimes he goes as far as saying that, and other times he talks about two worlds or different worlds, which implies the possibility of other worlds. And when he says that, he does, if we take this seriously, or as I suggest in the ontological sense of the term, that means that the building blocks of reality are not the same, right? I think we can best understand it through two parallels, and I hesitate to go to parallels because it often distorts but one parallel is post-colonial theory, right? When we talk about how we cannot use, right, European frameworks to understand, to speak about, right, colonized societies or colonized worlds, we must inherently root ourselves differently if we are to do such an exercise, which means we need to kind of fray our edges and language and let it, in some sense, be altered altogether. Another parallel, a little bit more radical or more out of the box, but go with me for a second and I'm ready for any pushback, is the transition from, in theoretical physics, from mechanical physics to quantum physics, so classic mechanics to quantum mechanics, right? So in this field, a century ago, right about when Du Bois was writing, people suggested the possibility to just change a presumption without understanding why, that particles are not continuous, that they are in some sense, right, are not of the same matter, or they can somehow, there are multiple explanations of that. One is the multiverse, which is currently popular, but we don't have to go that far. But the idea is that there are in fact multiple quanta, right, wherein different particles can, they're not, the transition from one to another is not continuous, right? And so what if we think about that radical paradigm shift? What if we think through social ontology through that paradigm shift as well? And I think Du Bois offers one way to do that. And I'm also here not necessarily suggesting a radical intervention myself. That's also something that has been written a lot about in Black studies, for instance, this quantum possibility of reality.
Great. So we have another question, this one from Rob.
Yes, thank you, Ashley, and thank you, Gil, and actually everybody. Like, I really enjoy these periodic talks and seeing people, particularly with kind of new COVID situation. But Gil, thank you so much. Really, really interesting. And I want to go very broad, but I'm not going to because it's very thought provoking. And I really like the call to, like, what if instead of emphasizing and focusing on connections, disjunctures, disconnections, separations, so thought-provoking on so many levels. I'm thinking about this in relation to something I'm thinking about people on probation and parole, building on some work Fergus has done about misrecognition. But the question I want to ask very specifically right now is, you talk about the veil. You made a comment towards the end where you said, mentioning the veil, it can be stitched together through legal and penal technologies, if I heard you correctly. And I just wanted to ask you, I found that a very interesting idea. If you don't mind just saying a little bit more, like expanding upon what you meant, if I understood you correctly.
Yes, thanks for picking that up. And actually, there's a chapter or a couple of chapters. I think that's a concept that can do a lot of great work. And in my work on this, I heavily draw on Fergus's work on misrecognition and the malopticon, and kind of and I specifically juxtapose there Foucault's account with Saidiya Hartman and the possibility that who insists, right, that we cannot simply see in the archive and go visit the archive, or for that instance, the kind of representations we produce of reality and treat them as continuous with reality, right? And so when I speak about penal and legal technologies as teaching the veil, I refer to, for instance, right, all of the ways, technologies in which or by which the world of the law, if to use for a second Du Bois's terms, gains vision, sees the world outside, the worlds outside, right? How the world of the law mediates realities from outside there to the core, to the halls of justice. And there are multiple, and it's a slightly different way, I think, to think about that, as opposed to the knowledge power diet or other ways of thinking about it. The question here is of mediation, and what happens in this mediation, right? And instead of presuming that this mediation somehow distorts the reality it represents, it degrades the reality, it degrades the representation, while the reality outside cannot be ever fully reduced to that representation, which produces that, misrecognition or misrepresentation. So that is an operation of a veil, one operation of the veil. The ankle monitor is a good example of the veil in that sense, but we can talk about clinical diagnosis, we can talk about probation officers' reports, we can talk about different technologies of seeing and of producing knowledge over bodies and people.
Fantastic. Okay, question from Fergus.
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed that and found it hugely stimulating. I'm kind of going back a little bit to Johan's question and trying to simplify it because this is a big move, and so it's hard to get the head around it. I think the thing I'm struggling with is maybe to do with the way that you're using ontology, or the word ontology, and I'm thinking about the relationship between lived experience and double consciousness as it relates to the lived experience of certain people. And then I guess in terms of ontology, there's the nature of being as experienced. And then there's the epistemologies that you build as you seek to interpret and generate knowledge from experience, so the making sense of the world that you inhabit. So when you talk about two worlds, just for the sake of clarity, you don't mean, this is probably too obvious to have to state, but you don't mean that there's more than one material world. You mean that people inhabiting the material world are experiencing it in ways so radically different that it makes sense to speak of there being more than one world. And that's because the lived experience of that material world is mediated by all sorts of things that are brought to bear on people's experiences. The kind of decolonizing point, and this I think is maybe the bit of it that I'm finding most useful, and which I think is maybe most challenging for punishment and society stuff, is to say you can't take one framing, or the framing that comes from one position, one world, and travel across into another set of experiences and expect that epistemological framing to apply. So we need to generate interpretations of experience in situ. So I guess I'm struggling to articulate it, but maybe the question is just to get you to articulate the relationship between the lived experience thing, it's specifically of double consciousness, and what the implications of that are for how we think about ontology and then epistemology. Is that making sense? It's essentially the same question as Johan's, I think, but maybe just explained worse.
No, thanks. I realize that this is a fraught aspect of the analysis, and probably one I need to think through in terms of what is my commitment there, to what level of claim I am committing, right? So I'm not now expressing a commitment to that register, but to go to the quanta, the physical world, the material world is not one, right? So we can actually be radical in that sense and suggest that we do not inhabit one material world. And there are readings of Du Bois that suggest as much. And there are recent, work in anthropology and anthropology of, even on anthropology writ large, but specifically anthropology of, for instance, US colonial and white supremacist practices that, for instance, utilize this notion to think of how a cell phone becomes a gun. And in that moment, it is materially a gun for the world of, the police officer or the, so yes, we can say that in some sense, the real nature of it is a cell phone, but on another very material register with very material consequences, it is a gun. So that's a radical articulation of it, and we can track back from that to the kind of articulation you suggested. I think that, you know, we inhabit one material world, or maybe it makes little sense or little, you know, sense to even try to talk about the real material world, since we inhabit, since it is mediated through such different experiences or lived experiences. And in that sense, we are inhabiting different materialities, right? So there is still a possibility of a material reality, but it is so heavily mediated that in that sense, it is actually, we can speak of two worlds without really treating it as metaphorical. I don't know if that answers the question, but we can, you know, backtrack further, but there are different articulations here that I think, you know, maybe I need to do more work there, certainly in the paper, to unpack. But anyway, it goes back to, right, the world, the lineage of ontology in the Fanonian tradition is exactly, that fits on that point, right? That we should take seriously the possibility that some people create the world and others inhabit it, or create other worlds, and take it materially as well.
Great. Next question is from Michael.
Hey, thanks, Gil, and thanks everyone who has jumped in before me to ask questions. This has been super fascinating and really stimulating, I want to say. So there, while you were speaking, I was like trying to put my finger on something, and I was like hovering around the outside of like some connection that my brain was like failing to make. But I think the Q&A discussion kind of got me to it, and it's that not that you need to like draw on or speak with even more like broad traditions, theoretically speaking, but there was one that I was curious about particular potential connections with, that if nothing else is using similar metaphors as you maybe, and that's like the traditions of various traditions of field theory. And I'm thinking specifically of like the way that folks like Pierre Bourdieu or Neil Fligstein talk about, in a different sort of way, but I think potentially related way, like how there are different worlds or fields, and there are different sort of rules to the games of those individual fields, and for different field agents within them, you know, the rules might apply in different ways. And I think that in some pretty fascinating ways, you're pulling Du Bois into that conversation in a way that at least I haven't really seen done in any systematic way. And I'm just curious, like the extent to which you may or may not have thoughts on this, but like the extent to which what your project is attempting to do sort of either meshes with or maybe diverges from those other approaches to trying to make sense of, like, you know, messy, complex social worlds that, you know, generate different lived realities for different people, and specifically like that the element of it, like moving from one field, to use that metaphor, to another, and how that can like be very jarring and paralyzing and terrifying. And I think there's at least a couple ways that what you're doing is really kind of blowing up in a positive sense that tradition, which I guess I should also add isn't necessarily one that's super commonly brought into punishment studies, with a couple of major exceptions. Like Loic Wacan obviously brings it in, and then like Josh Page has done that as well in his work. But anyway, the two kind of ways I see what you're doing adding to that are, one, I think really asserting that we should recognize Du Bois as like antecedent in a way to field theoretical approaches, because I had never really thought about his work in these terms, but you've kind of maybe prompted me to do so, that maybe part of what he's contributing is, you know, exactly that. But also that it renders much more explicit, if not for the first time finally actually explicit, like the primacy of race, you know, within different overlapping fields and the manner in which that could dramatically alter how we might conceptualize things like forms of capital that people possess within fields and how different field agents are perceived, what sort of resources they have access to, and how, and it puts like a good kind of why to a lot of it. So I don't know how to put that in the form of a question other than to ask, like, I don't know, what does that sound like to your ear? If I just bounce that off of you, does that align with how you're thinking of it? Or am I like totally missing the mark?
Thank you. That's really thought-provoking. I do see right. So I didn't talk about the different orientations, as I call them, chronologically, but we can, roughly, following others, describe the field theory as more kind of recent in punishment society. And I do see that movement away or shift away from more kind of holistic approaches to field theory as an attempt, as actually one response to the problem of disjuncture, that we need different analytic vocabularies or different, maybe not necessarily analytic vocabularies, but we need a vocabulary to allow us to make sense of different spheres or fields of existence. And I think there's a lot more to say about that. But I do still think that there is a big difference, right? As you said, I think that Du Bois does something very different. I think first it's awkward, or not awkward in an analytic sense, to talk about, I don't know, for instance, right, a community, right, of youth and people and kins, and right, like struggling under and striving also as a field. It's not exactly the same thing as, so in that sense, field theory allows us to speak a lot about the world of power, the world of resource, the world of capital, of a certain kind, but it kind of is limited in other respects. And also what field theory does is to create Bourdieu is a good example of that. Is a master of that, of creating one overarching vocabulary that is ultimately, or should ultimately, be able to kind of capture everything that exists, all the dynamics within fields, between fields, the transitions of capitals, the conversion of capital, the conversion of rules from one to another, right? And this is exactly what I think Du Bois allows us to think differently, and importantly so. And in this sense, right, I also focus specifically on that, on those spaces where, I think that that's actually under theorized in Bourdieu, though others have done that. The spaces between fields, if we think of the color line not as a line but rather as a space, and here actually what I do is tap onto other traditions which, for instance, if you it's less prominent in sociology, but Gloria Anzaldúa work on the borderland or La Frontera, and how the different where different words actual, right? She writes about how the U.S. and Mexico and the mestiza world that she comes from are different worlds, and yet she somehow manages and translates herself and others in that position between them. That's something that I think is missing from field theory, but or is not the project of field theory, let's say it like that. But I think still field theory can has been evolving for a while, so I may be missing a lot here. So
That's super thought-provoking. Thank you.
Great. So just to jump on that last one, Sidaloo has I think relatively recent article. I can't remember if it's out yet, or because I read it when it was still in draft form, but he's talking about how there are like 9 different types of players on a field that help with that transitional and translational work, and that might be useful for kind of looking at that. But I want to jump in. I don't see any more hands, so I'm going to give my comment and a question. So my comment, I'm making as a comment, not a question, because I feel like it would be unfair to ask you at the moment, especially since I would have to look something up to actually fully ask it. But basically, I'd be curious to hear more about how your intervention is both similar and different from interventions that we've seen recently in criminology, both in American criminology and British criminology, to basically move from thinking of race as a variable and taking it more seriously and theorizing race, and kind of thinking through. So we all know how, like, there's criminology, there's punishment society, there's law and society. Speaking of like multiple fields that are kind of overlapping, and we go between them, and we use different norms and different theories and assumptions in these different fields. Kind of thinking through how, like for example, Nicole Van Cleve, I think it was Lara Milan, their article calling for kind of moving away from like racial blindness in criminology. Coretta Phillips' work on like British criminology in the absence of race, and especially attention to Black people in British criminology, and kind of thinking about what are those calls and how do they differ from like your more Du Boisian call, and like kind of thinking about is that a reflection of this is like a more theoretical intervention perhaps? Is it more that it's specific to Du Bois? Or is there also something about law and society, punishment society are unique and distinct from criminology? And kind of thinking about how does this also, kind of coming back to your discussion of how we've done things in the field and how you've tailored this to make the interventions there. It might be interesting to see kind of how you would reframe this for, say, a standard criminology audience. Or if it like wouldn't go anywhere because this is really for punishment society. So that's a comment. You don't have to answer that. My question is one about agency and structure, of course. So you use the term refusal a couple of times, and I like the quote you gave at the end from Du Bois, where it's like there are two parts of the person or two people really housed within one, and they don't fit together, and they're kind of like, there's this tension between them. You can't reconcile them. They're kind of refusing to work together. But there are some other times where you use the idea of refusal, and that quote at the end kind of helped me to make sense of what you mean by refusal. Because I always think of refusal as a very agentic kind of thing, like I refuse to do this thing. And so I was wondering, to what extent is it actually a result of agency? Like who is saying I refuse to belong? And how much of this is a reflection of structure, and especially kind of structural incompatibility that is incompatible by design? Because if we have major social structures designed by white people, either totally forgetting about the comforts of Black people or explicitly to make Black people uncomfortable, their like structure and agency get all screwed up. But the end result is you have the structure in place that then might be creating this incompatibility. So I was just kind of trying to work through these different, is it structure, is it agency, is it both, is it this weird cycle of things for every time we hear this idea of refusal? So weird question, but I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks. Quickly for the first question, I heard a question there, but I mean, it's something I'm gonna think through. I think of what I'm doing as very continuous with those interventions. In thinking of the transition, for instance, about the transition from thinking about race as a variable, as opposed to thinking of lived experience as alternative or independent point of origin from which to think, right? Like it's an entire like shift of like a different lens that we put on, and we can't use it as a variable because that's what constructs variables in the first place, or something like that. So very, very continuous with that. I do think that, what I'm trying to do draws on that and tries to also kind of find or connect. I mean, you're right, this is a different field. And I think this intervention is field specific. But one thing I want to do is to kind of ground that interventions or find some lineages in Du Bois for those kind of interventions. I think there are many other lineages as well. But I think that's something that, we collaboratively need to work on, to ground that, because we don't need to reinvent things or reimagine things. We actually need to remember what we forgot or what we excluded or marginalized. So that's the part of, that's the kind of work. As for this question of agency or structure, gonna be, I need to, you know, I will be continuing to think through that. But one, so first refusal, you know, I'm glad you picked up on that term. I'm not developing in this paper, though it's central to my dissertation. Refusal is actually, it's not my concept. It comes from many others, and specifically comes one, you know, immediate. So there's a recent paper by Savannah Shang, an anthropology of Black girlhood, where basically she talks about ethnographic refusals. Also, she draws on Jackson's work before. But the idea there is that people can just refuse to be seen, right? People are refuse to be seen. It's not an assertion of, it's not an act of resistance as much as an assertion of opacity. You know, I'm just like not gonna play the game. I'm gonna, you can see, it's like it marks a boundary between, or plays on the boundary between discerning and knowing, right? Yeah, so you discern, but you cannot know. So that's an assertion of refusal, or that's a kind of refusal, which in that sense is not exactly an expression of agency, as much as it is a certain protective layer in which one can, you know, continue to live their lives in one form of or another, right? About agency, I'm continuously working through this term. There are critiques of this term coming from Black studies, coming from Black history, coming from post-colonial work, in which, you know, agency has been thought of as, or analyzed as, you know, as, because it's the antithesis of structure, it kind of does not allow us to get out of this dyad, structure agency. So we really don't, right? And Du Bois actually, in Sociology Hesitant, in this 1905 essay, he also critiques or articulates an inchoate or incipient critique of agency, I think, where he speaks about, you know, we cannot make sense of human action with a term, with an analytic term. It's so profound and complex, and that the attempt to even reduce it to an analytic vocabulary is already reductive. So I'm not trying to get into that mess right now because it feels like, you know, gonna be a challenge, but the preliminary ruminations about, you know, the relationship between refusal and agency.
That's super helpful. Thank you. So any final questions, comments from anyone before we close out?
I guess one quick question is, can you mention again the name of the author or the chapter about refusal that you just referenced, Gil?
Yes, it's Savannah Shang. She has a paper, but also she has a recent or a book called, I think, Progressive Dystopias.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, thank you. And just thanks so much for the talk would be my final comment, like very thought-provoking.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Could I beg Gil's and Ashley's forbearance just to share one reflection that's been really just right at the front of my brain throughout listening to you talk. It's not offered as like a question, not even as a comment, but it's been so resonant that I wanted to share it, and on the off chance it might have some resonance for you too, Gil, that I throughout this evening's event, I mean, it's probably morning where Ashley is, but like in London, it's evening. I was reminded of a friend who was teaching in San Francisco Unified School District, trying to teach restorative justice principles, and was confronting over and over again the problem that she had this puzzle of, well, what approach ought I take with equipping the students I teach for conflict resolution. I bring them up in a restorative justice school. I inculcate in them restorative justice principles of conflict neutralization and nonviolent resolution. But then they go out into the world, and one of my kids just last week, as she was explaining to me, one of my kids just last week on the subway on BART was spoken to very rudely by a police officer, who the kid then confronts using all of the tools that she's been training in school, and tries to initiate a kind of a resolution, only to be then confronted with the reality that the police officer just will not, that's not how this is going to work. And she was then kind of reflecting on, well, all right, so what am I supposed to do here? Am I supposed to bring the kid up with the tools to be able to think about nonviolent resolution according to restorative justice principles because of the world we would like them to be able to fashion for themselves, where they're able to exercise autonomy and respect and dignity and to be able to overcome violence? Or do we want to train them for the world that they're actually going to inhabit? And she was using that was her language, not mine. She was using the language of different worlds, of multiple worlds. And I just wanted to share that with you as just what really sparked something quite meaningful in a very profound sense about this evening. And so, and I wanted to, I offered that by way of gratitude that to you. Okay.
One avenue I did not touch on is translation, and specifically, pedagogy of translation. Paulo Freire. So, kind of what the student you were talking about, could have, kind of like one has to reconcile or contend with the dominant language while translating. So.
Thanks so much, Gil.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Ashley, so much for, organizing and facilitating.
No problem. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. And thank you, everyone, for attending. This has been fabulous. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording now.